now you can hear me. Okay, what I'm going to do is, hey, where's the timer? I'm on a strict time limit. Yeah, I'm on a strict time limit. Okay, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to talk about digital activism. Let me take you back on a journey through time, way back to 1995, when I started my PhD research on digital activism, which of course didn't exist at the time. We were trying to talk about online activism, but at that point most people weren't online either. The World Wide Web had only been invented in 1993, so at that point you probably had an email address, you might have had a website if you're particularly techie. But you know, we didn't have much access. You might have had one of those gigantic mobile phones, but we weren't networking very much at all. But I wanted to talk about digital activism. So that's me, that's what I'm doing. Okay, so the background to what I was doing was, I was in an international relations department. So I'd done my master's there, and of course 1995, remember, was not that long after the end of the Cold War. And so, are you okay with that? Squeaky thing. Okay, not that long after the end of the Cold War, so my department was populated by people who were, they were Sovietologists, they were American foreign policy experts. They were very interested in this, this superpower history, and that was the structure of the world that they were mostly thinking about. With hindsight, what they were doing was mourning the loss of their fabulous careers. You know, the Berlin Wall had just come down. They'd, you know, the collapse of communism had blown it completely for them, and they're all desperately wondering what a Sovietologist does in that environment. And then people like me come along and go, but surely that's not politics anyway. What about these things? What about, you know, like Greenpeace and these transnational activists who are getting involved? You know, Greenpeace started in 1969, Stonewall 1989, animal rights activists, Amnesty International started in 1961, women's rights, the civil rights movements during the 60s. You know, there's a very strong sense that what politicians and academics saw as politics wasn't really politics as certainly I understood it. I went on marches like this, I went on protests, and that wasn't my sense of politics. So as a young whippersnapper, I'm looking at this going, well, what is this stuff? I don't understand your politics. So a lot of scholars have looked at this idea of social movements and activism and have said, okay, well, how do we actually understand what these people are doing? You know, they don't just chain themselves to railings for no reason at all. So they have these ideas. I'm going to go through them very quickly. Okay, structure of political opportunities and constraints. That's the type of system that you live within. You know, are you allowed to protest? Do you have rights for free association? Do you have the education to be able to access the information that you need? Looking at things like forms of organisation available, you know, do you have access to photocopiers, do you have access to computers, access to funding and so on. Collective consciousness, that one's easy, you know, for example, civil rights movement says racial discrimination is wrong. It doesn't matter where you're from, black or white, left or right, whatever you are, rich or poor, if you believe that racial discrimination was wrong, then you cared about the civil rights movement. And then finally, non-institutionalized strategies. So these are all the methods of protest that don't involve putting your cross in the box on voting day. You know, so chaining yourself to railings, getting involved in marches and so on and so forth. So this is what social movements are. But then you look at, okay, so we've got these activists, we've got these transnational political ideas, and we've got these sort of social movement structures that people are not just random acts. How are we going to do that these days? In 1995, remember, it's these days that we're talking about. So we go, well, this is how we do it, hooray! We've got these amazing technologies now. You know, so we have these mobile phones, we have these computers, we can do things, you know, we can use these transnational technologies to promote these transnational ideas, and we can all network together, and we can all change the world. Isn't that going to be amazing? Now remember that these things, they seemed pretty amazing at the time. You know, we can move information around more quickly, we can move it around moving, and you can increase vastly the amount of information that you're sharing. So you have this opportunities for doing this. Now, if you look at that now, it all seemed pretty amazing at the time. I heard just the other week when they launched the new Xbox 3 that the servers that they were using to service the launch, and only the launch, were more powerful than the entire global system in 1999. So that's how lame this stuff was in 1995. But it seemed pretty important at the time. Transnational technologies and transnational activism. I'll go through these very quickly. These were the organisations that I was focusing most of my research on. Campaign for Accountability of American Bases. They were fantastic. They were old school Greenham Common women who didn't like the internet at all. They just used to go and launch themselves at the gates of the Menwith Hill base and wait until the soldiers came out to rescue them. There was one disabled woman in her 60s who used to throw herself out of her wheelchair so that the soldiers would come out and look after her. They'd take her back inside because they didn't want to leave the gates open behind them, but they didn't also want to lock themselves out. So they'd take her back inside and then she'd just get all her flags out and start shouting. they were just brilliant. But they didn't like the internet at all. Squall was an anarchist organisation who didn't like anybody, including academic researchers as it turned out, but that's another story altogether. Indie media still exists pretty much in the same form as it did then, as a independent anti-media or alternative media network. And then One World was set up as an organisation that was about using communications for global change. That was what they wanted it for. So basically they had very different approaches to the internet, and for me as someone who's trying to work out how activists can use the internet, they were sort of very valuable sources. But if we look at what the internet was like in 1995, it wasn't as useful as it might have seemed. And some of these, the BBC, for example, didn't come online until 1997. Google was 1996. Blogger didn't come around until 1999. So these kind of templates, our understanding of how we can use the internet, is very different at that point. Amazon was already online by then, so you could start to search for obscure books and so on. Yahoo was up there, so you had a search engine, but there wasn't really there very much to find, because there weren't that many interesting websites to be looking at. So you had some stuff. There was something to look for, but not that much. So what happened was, I managed to do my research. I got my PhD with these very limited resources. But during the, what do we call them, the 2000s, the tauties, the tooties, the noughties, sorry. During the noughties, we started to see quite significant changes in the way that people could engage in activism online. So first of all, the biggest one was this rise of citizen journalists and user-generated content. Now you may remember that the 2005 tube bombings signalled a kind of turning point for the relationship between the mainstream media and citizen journalists, though we didn't even know we were citizen journalists then. But the first time the BBC and the Times both published pictures from underground that one of the victims of the bombing had taken. And that was the very first time that they'd ever used photos from the public. And so that made a dramatic sea change in the way that the media responded to citizens. We also, this term producers, where we're basically all producers and users of information at the same time. So I'll write a blog post, Katie shares it, she shares it on her networks, Danielle shares it on her networks, and it goes further and further. So it goes beyond people, far beyond my reach, and then people comment on it. I comment on Katie's post, I say thank you very much, Katie. By the way, did you see this one that I saw, and so on. So these networks just expand and expand, and we're sharing and producing at the same time. Aggregator sites, things like Dig, Katie might share that blog post on Dig, and then that just disappears into networks that none of us are actually directly aware of at all. So it's not people we're connected with, they go off into networks way beyond that. And then the online petition sites, I'm pissed off about honeybees and I want to say something about that. So we had all of these new mechanisms for adding information and sharing information. So then what we get is this, academics start to use this pejorative term, the armchair activist, blah, blah, Syria, blah, blah, honeybees, blah, blah, fracking. I've looked down my timeline today. People are talking about all of these things. They talk about them every day, probably sitting there with a great big bag of crisps and a big glass of wine. But I kind of think we have to look at places and context. I couldn't be in Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring. I could, if I could sit in my chair and let someone know that I was angry about it, is that a form of activism? I don't know. I shall leave that one to you to debate. I don't know. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. Okay, one of the things that we need to look at when we're talking about this global reach, a lot of it seems to be the idea that, we've got the internet, and everybody's networked, and everybody's using everything, and we're all sharing. But actually, if we look at certain places and the type of technology that's being used for activism, we look at, the UK is a very, very wired country. I think when we all sit on our smartphones and tweet all day, we forget that we're much more wired than a lot of other places. And particularly places where, you need quite a lot of on-the-ground activism sometimes. So places like India and China, the growth in internet use has been quite significant, but not as significant as the rise in mobile phone use. Mobile phone use is still really, really important for activists in a lot of countries. It matters here, but it probably matters more in some other countries. And part of the reason for that is it's cheaper, much more easy to use. You don't need to be literate to use a mobile phone, and you don't need to be able to speak English. You can communicate in your own language. So a lot of the sharing of information by using mobile phones is done. A lot of information sharing by activists is done with mobile phones. So, mobile phones here, we can use them, we can sit on our smartphones and we can walk down, rig it, and we can go, I think I might go to Primark. Hang on a sec, I'll have a check on Bangkok and see if I'm allowed to go in Primark yet, or can I shop in H&M, or where am I allowed to go? So we can use our smartphones for activism on a day-to-day basis, like using apps if we want to. Things like we can work out our carbon footprints as we're wandering around, we're hopping on the bus, we're driving our 4x4s or whatever it is. But some other kinds of mobile phones are used much more often in other places, as I mentioned. They don't need to be smart, they don't need to be wired, they need to be cheap, and they need to give you the chance to talk to people. So I'm just going to skip past that, because one example of that here is One World. One World was the organisation I mentioned earlier, of Communications for Global Change. And what they did recently in 2011 at the Mali elections, they had almost 2,000 people on the ground who they'd given mobile phones to, who were based in the polling stations, making sure that the elections were free and fair. So they were texting coded SMS messages back to a central base so that the elections could be monitored without the without the authorities or the local politicians knowing that they were being monitored. So there's that kind of activism going on, these very powerful networks that are relatively invisible to us in this type of world. Just want to flick back there to some of the organisations that we have now. So, the opportunities for activism have increased exponentially, and even if it is just us sitting, clicking in chairs, I think it's quite important. But you have a VAS. Have any of you ever signed an VAS petition? Yeah? Okay. Alright, so that makes you and me among the 70 million members of a VAS. Once you've clicked on a petition once, you're on their stats counter. So 70 million members of a VAS. I don't want to get controversial, people, but I kind of think, I do really like a VAS, and I like a lot of the things that they do. I do still think, looking across their map of where they're involved and who's involved with them, I think there might be some concerns that there's still a very sort of Western-dominated agenda of what's important. Not necessarily, but that would be a point for a heated debate. Of course, we have our social media that we use constantly, sharing information all over the place. Like I say, my timeline is full of frack-off messages today, among other things. Not to me personally, I hasten to add. 38 Degrees is kind of our British version of a VAS, I guess. And these e-petitions now that we can fill in, you know, they used to seem a bit ridiculous, but I think maybe these days politicians are more inclined to listen to 1 million signatures online than they might to 1,000 signatures delivered to their door. It used to work the other way. They used to say that you needed 10 or more signatures online for each single signature you had on paper for politicians to take any notice. This e-petitions link here actually goes to the British government, and the British government site now have one where you can just start your own petition tonight. So those things that Savannah was talking about before, if you've got something that's bothering you, you can go online and do that. I mean, the ones, I checked it out today, our choices were bring back hanging and don't let kittens get sold without their mothers being present, which I actually think is quite important. But I probably wouldn't have started a petition for it online. I'm just saying, but you know, if you want the government to know about these things, then that's your place to do it. And then so, you know, we've come all the way along here. Did anything change? Structure, political opportunities and constraints. If you remember, that was about kind of like the legal frameworks and so on that were available to us. Now on the one hand, structurally, God, yes, we've got loads more access to information. We definitely can access tons more than we did. But you know, as the recent NSA revelations have shown, we're under surveillance a lot more as well. So weighing up the pros and cons of whether these structures have become more open and better, who knows? That's one for you to decide. Forms of organisation available, yes, definitely, we can share information all over the place, that's not a problem, and much, much more than we ever had in the past. Collective consciousness, yes, definitely, it's maybe a bit more diffuse, but the opportunities for sharing information that can reach wider networks and connect me with you or with you if we happen to think about the same things, those opportunities are much greater than, you know, the immediate networks we used to have access to. Non-institutionalised strategies, this is probably one where the internet has been at its most creative and most valuable for actors in terms of sharing information and, you know, yeah, the Occupy movement and what's some of the fantastic movements that have just slipped out of my head. But you know, a lot of the gatherings, say during the Arab Spring in Syria and Egypt and so on, very well connected networks and new forms of activism, flash mobs and things like that can happen very quickly without the surveillance of the authorities. So I say, yes, on balance, the internet has provided lots of great opportunities for activism. I don't necessarily think that has made us more political, because I think still a lot of us spend more time with things like this online. Thank you.